When I woke up, very confused, she said, "You almost died last night. In fact, no one can believe you were alive."
I went into the games not knowing what was coming.
As humans, we just hate uncertainty.
You just sensed that it was out there.
You have to start somewhere.
We're all programmed to push ourselves even farther.
This is On the X, an IRONCLAD original. Welcome to On the X. I'm Chris Irwin. My guest today is Johann Hari. Johann is a highly renowned journalist and best-selling author. He has been named National Newspaper Journalist of the Year by Amnesty International and recognized as both Cultural Commentator of the Year and Environmental Commentator of the Year at the Comment Awards. His TED Talks also have over 93 million views, and he's the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers. Chasing the Scream is about the war on drugs and inspired the Oscar-nominated film The United States vs. Billie Holiday, and the documentary series The Fix with Samuel L. Jackson. His second book, Lost Connections, was shortlisted for a British Medical Association award and praised for uncovering the real causes of depression. His third book, Stolen Focus, about our waning attention spans, was named one of the best books of the year by Amazon. In his latest release, Magic Pill, he explores society's interest in the new weight loss drugs through his personal experience with Ozempic. Johann is personally one of my favorite authors. I absolutely love his work, and I was so excited to speak with him. Unfortunately, he only had about 45 minutes to spend with us, so there's a bunch of topics and questions we didn't get to. But hopefully we can reserve those for another time and get him back on. So here we go with Johann Hari on the X. So I think what I like so much about the way you write is there's people out there that are authors and they can go and they can research a subject, something that's interesting to them, and they can write a book about it. Or they can write like their memoirs or a biography about themselves or something like that. You have done this thing where you sort of weave your own personal experiences into all of your books. So they're about a topic that I think is very relevant to sort of the zeitgeist of the current society. But it's something you personally have had like a struggle with, or something that you've had an issue with. And you have this great ability to sort of weave your own narrative about, hey, this is a thing that we're all told this thing about. I don't know if that's really true. Is that really true? Are we being told the right thing? And I just think you do such a good job of that. So let's just start off just real quick. What what made you want to be a writer to start off? Like at what point in your life did you say, hey, this is what I'm going to do with my life?
The honest answer is it's literally the only thing I can do. I'm completely incompetent in every way. Even we've only been speaking a short time, Chris, I'm confident you would survive the apocalypse. I will die 10 minutes into the apocalypse, right? Like during COVID, I got a text from a friend of mine who I hadn't seen since I was like 16 years old. And I was like, she just said, "Oh, Johann, I've been thinking of you. Are you okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's very nice of you to ask. Why do you ask?" She said, "I don't know if you remember this, but when we were kids, we watched a film about some apocalypse. And we all talked about the point in the collapse of civilization where we would just kill ourselves, right?" Mm-hmm. And she said, "You said it's when they shut all the branches of KFC and McDonald's." And she said, "I realized they have actually done that. So I wanted to check that you were right." Yeah. And I was like, wow, my teenage vision of the apocalypse has come to pass. Yeah. So basically it's my only talent. It's the only thing I can do. Also, I suppose a slightly sadder answer, which is that I grew up in a family where there was a lot of addiction, a lot of madness, literal madness. And the way I would cope with that was by reading and writing all the time. It was my way of being in a different place in my own mind. So my sister said to me once, I used to really envy you because when it was all so crazy, I would look at you and you would just be sitting there reading a book, and I couldn't do that. So yeah, I think it was also, it was an adaptation that turned out to be an advantage in all sorts of ways. And I wouldn't recommend having, addiction in your family. It's not worth it, but if you may as well get something good out of it. So yeah, I think it was probably a combination of those things. Also, I think I'm just someone who's driven by curiosity. All my books are about a mystery that I wanted to solve for myself, right? My first book, Chasing the Scream, is, like I say, we had a lot of addiction in my family. I wanted to understand what causes addiction, what can you do about it? So to find the answers, I went on this big journey all over the world. Lost Connections, my book about depression, is about, I wrote it when I was about to turn 40. And every single year that I've been alive, depression and anxiety had increased in the United States, in Britain, across the Western world. And I was like, well, why? And why is that happening? Why is it that each year that passes, more and more of us are finding it harder to get through the day? And most importantly, how do we reverse that trend? The third book I wrote, Stolen Focus, was about why so many of us are struggling to focus and pay attention. And my most recent book, Magic Pill, is about the new weight loss drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy and what they're going to mean for all of us. And for all of them, I have some ideas about them before I start writing the book, but I'm not an expert, right? I'm a person who wants to find out what's going on. And I go on a journey with the reader to kind of find out what's going on.
Yeah. And so I want to touch on, obviously I want to talk about your most recent book, because that's kind of what's the most current thing for you. But I do want to touch a little bit on the other books, because part of me feels like when I look at your body of work, all of it kind of traces back to, if I had to pick like an overarching theme, it's mental health. Is that fair to say? I mean, I could kind of say addiction in some aspect between all of them, but I feel like there's almost like a bigger one there, or one that's over top of all of those of mental health. Is that fair to say? And was that intentional?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's a slightly different connecting thread, though it leads to the topic you're bringing up. Everyone listening knows that they have natural physical needs, right? Obviously, you need food, you need water, you need clean air, you need shelter. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And the culture we built today is good at many things. I'm glad to be alive today. But we've been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs. And that is manifesting for a lot of people as things like depression, anxiety, addiction, overeating, attention problems. Now, there's lots of things going on with all of those things, right? It doesn't explain everything. But I do think it drives a significant amount of what's happening. And I think it drives a lot of the rise in why those things are happening. It's not, like I said, it's definitely not the only factor. There's lots of other things as well. So I think that's a sort of connecting thread. I prefer to think of it as emotional health rather than mental health. Mental health, people picture a diagram of a brain, right? And something going on with the brain. And of course, there is a biological component to all of these problems for some people, but it's one component among many. So yeah, I try to think of it more as like emotional health, psychological health.
Okay, cool. I would probably group those things together, because when I definitely separate, like in my community, veteran community, we talk a lot about brain health. And I'm always like, that's completely different from mental health, as far as I'm concerned, or like mind health, right? Brain's just an organ in your body. When I think mental health, I think your experience, like what it's like to be you, that component of it. So, so I would probably put those things together. So let's dive in a little bit to that. So just to kind of summarize some of this work that you've done up to date. So the first book about addiction, right? What was the biggest thing about addiction that sort of, you were able to uncover from that, from your work with Chasing the Scream?
So many things blew my mind. I thought it was a subject I've been seeing play out pretty much all my life. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I was too young then to understand why. But obviously, as I got older, I understood there was addiction in my family. And I mean, I learned so much about, drugs are not what we think they are. Addiction is not what we think it is. The war on drugs is not what we think it is. The alternatives to the war on drugs are not what we think they are. But I guess the biggest bombshell for me out of many, there are loads of things I could say in answer to this, but for me, the biggest was the transformation I learned in my understanding of what addiction actually is. So if you had asked me when I started doing the research for the book a really long time ago now, 14 years ago, if you'd asked me Johann, what causes addiction? I would have looked at you like you were an idiot. And I would have said, well, let's say heroin addiction, because that's something that was close to me, right? I would have said, well, the clue's in the name, right? Obviously, heroin causes heroin addiction, right? we've been told this story for 100 years that's become totally part of our common sense. It was certainly part of mine. So we think if you and me kidnapped the next 20 people to walk past your apartment, and like a villain in a Saw movie, we injected them with heroin every day, 3 times a day for a month. At the end of that month, they'd all be heroin addicts for a simple reason. There's chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to desperately physically crave. And at the end of that month, they'd have this tremendous physical hunger for the chemical hook in the drug. It's why, in English, another word for being addicted is being hooked, right? We think addiction is the craving for the chemical hook. And it turns out there's some truth in that story. Chemical hooks are real, but they're actually a very small part of what's going on. And the first thing that alerted me to that fact is when it was explained to me by lots of scientists. As you can tell from my weird Downton Abbey accent, I'm British, and I'm in Britain at the moment. I'm half the year in the US. If I stepped out into the street now and I got hit by a truck and I broke my hip, I'd be taken to hospital and I'd be given a load of a drug called diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's medically pure heroin. It's much better than the shit I could score on the streets, right? It's the good stuff. People in British hospitals are given diamorphine for quite long periods of time. If anyone listening has a British grandmother who's ever had a hip replacement operation, your grandma's taken a lot of heroin, right? If what we think about addiction is right, that it's caused primarily or entirely by exposure to the drug, what should be happening to all these people in British hospitals who are being given like medical grade heroin? Loads of them should be leaving and trying to score on the streets. This has been studied very carefully. It does not happen. And when I first learned that, I thought, well, that just can't be right. Firstly, I thought about the opioid crisis in the US. Secondly, I thought about how could that possibly be? How could you have someone in a hospital bed, then be given loads of really powerful heroin, they don't become addicted. You've got someone shooting up in the alleyway outside, actually taking a weaker form of the drug, they do become addicted. How can that be? And I only began to understand it when I went to Vancouver and interviewed an incredible man named Professor Bruce Alexander, who did an experiment that's really transformed how we think about addiction all over the world. So Professor Alexander explained to me this theory we have about addiction, that it's caused primarily or entirely by the chemical hooks in the drug, comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're very simple experiments. Anyone listening, you can try them at home if you feel a little bit sadistic. You take a rat, you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water. The other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drug water and almost always kill itself quite quickly by overdosing. You might remember there was a famous advertisement in the 80s that showed this by Partnership for Drug-Free America and said, like, it will happen to you, right? But Professor Alexander came along and looked at this experiment and said, well, hang on a minute. You put the rat alone in an empty cage. It's got nothing that makes life worth living for rats. All it's got is the drugs, right? What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically like heaven for rats. They got loads of friends, they got loads of cheese, they got loads of colored balls, they can have loads of sex. Anything a rat wants in life is there in Rat Park. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drug water. And of course they try both because they don't know what's in them. This is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drug water very much. None of them use it compulsively. None of them overdose. There's significantly lower drug use when the rats are in an environment where their deeper needs are met, where the things that make life meaningful to rats are there. Now, there's lots of evidence this same dynamic plays out in human beings. And I remember when I first heard that, walking away from meeting Professor Alexander and thinking to myself, well, so the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, valuable though that is to many people. The opposite of addiction is connection. That the core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be. And once you understand that, you can see why what we do in the United States and in Britain is such a disaster. Our theory of addiction is, well, if you're addicted, we need to inflict pain on you to give you an incentive to stop, right? Most of the money we spend is punishing addicts. But when you understand that pain is the driver of addiction, suddenly you realize, oh, actually, it's actually making the problem worse, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it blew my mind that it really reframed my own life experiences and how I think we should respond as a society.
On the X is proudly presented by Mechanics Wear, the gloves trusted by pros. Originally designed by a legendary race mechanic, Mechanics Wear has become the top choice for anyone who needs tough, reliable protection. From construction sites to the front lines, these gloves offer unbeatable comfort, durability, and grip. Stay cool, dry, and in control with Mechanics Wear. Gear up for whatever comes your way. And just speaking personally, Mechanics gloves were the go-to glove for us in the military, certainly. And they're still my go-to glove when it comes to just working around the house. Glove that I've worn for decades at this point, and it's still kind of my go-to glove. Mechanics Wear gloves are available at most retailers, as well as on mechanics.com and on GSA Advantage. Mechanics Wear is also proud to offer an exclusive 15% off discount through the ID.me program to military, veterans, and first responders. Click on the ID.me button in your shopping cart and follow the steps to verify your eligibility. Is it connection and purpose as well? Because I've heard you say that too. Is it a sense of, is that a piece of it as well? Just people, because I think of sort of the veteran community of people that you spend a long time in the military and you have this real sense of purpose, and then people get out, and a lot of people struggle there mentally, and some people get addicted to alcohol or drugs or whatever it may be, and get depressed and all these things you talk about. And for me, some of that goes back to they've lost a sense of purpose as well. Some of it is camaraderie with other people, it's connections with folks, but it's purpose too. Is that a component as well?
Totally. I think of connection in the broadest possible sense. It's obviously what my book Lost Connections is about. When we talk about connection, of course, the most obvious thing we think of is connection to other people, right?
Yep.
And that is really important. And, you know, we are the loneliest society in human history now. So that's a big factor. But there's a lot of other factors. Like you say, there's connection to meaningful work. There's connection to meaningful values, which we're really cut off from at the moment. There's connection to the natural world, has really profoundly healing effects. There's all sorts of, I go through 9 of them in the book. So I think you're right. And I think it's really interesting to think about this in relation to your community. And you know vastly more about this than I do. But I noticed you heard that you'd interviewed Sebastian Junger. And he's very interesting on this, because he, if I remember correctly, he talks about, for many people in the military, actually, the moment of acute distress is when they leave and they no longer have that tribe and that sense of purpose and that sense of meaning. That actually, of course, there can be traumatizing elements of military service, not least, you know, one so obvious I don't need to go into. But it's interesting that trauma usually or often manifests after the departure from the military back in civilian life, where in civilian life as we now live it in most parts of the world, most parts of the developed world, that means kind of disappearing into a vacuum where people don't know each other, where, you know, most people don't find meaning in their work, where we're taught that life is about, you know, getting likes on Instagram and, you know, accumulating money in your bank account, just absolute bullshit values. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We need to understand connection in the deepest possible sense.
Yeah. Well, when I look at that list too of the connections, the disconnections that you talk about, I mean, man, so many of them would apply to exiting the military. Disconnection from meaningful work, from other people, from meaningful values, from status and respect. Like those are, yeah, I can run down the list and just check those things off, right?
You know, I think a lot about this because as you're saying that, I'm thinking a lot about for the last, for an insane amount of time, for 13 years, I've been researching a book I've not yet finished, which is about a series of crimes that are taking place in Las Vegas. So I've been spending a lot of time with the people who live for many, many years now, in the people who live in the drainage tunnels beneath Vegas. For people who don't know, there's a huge number of homeless people live in the tunnels. And obviously a lot of them are ex-service members who I've got to know very well. And the fucking outrage of a society that would send people, you know, to do the most dangerous work, and then when they get back abandon them, so they're literally living in the drains. I find it hard to, I find it hard to talk about.
Yeah.
It must be 100 times worse for you. To think about that.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. And it's tough because veterans in this country are, I think, treated way better than they probably ever have been in our history. I mean, I don't know if that's 100% true, but certainly there's times from post-Vietnam War where they were not treated well. And now it's much more, obviously, thank you for your service and all of that. But I think the challenge this is what we do at the foundation, is trying to figure out, okay, but we still have issues that people struggle with post-service, and there's still things, there's ways that people need help that aren't provided by the government and they aren't provided by maybe society at large. And like, how do you find those things, right? And I think you can open this aperture up, and this is kind of what you talk about here with how to solve some of this. So how do you do that, right? Like, how do you find, and it applies to the kind of the first book and your second book, like how do we do some of this in our current day and age? Because look, we are isolated more, and things like COVID certainly made that worse. I know personally, I tend to isolate just on my own. I'm kind of an introvert, and it's tough to try to not do that. So how do we do that? I guess as individuals and even as society too.
Yeah. So the first thing we need to do is understand the problem differently. So, there was a moment this really fell into place for me when I was doing the research for Lost Connections. I went to interview a South African psychiatrist called Dr. Derek Summerfield. And he told me this story. He happened to be in Cambodia in Southeast Asia in 2001, when they first introduced chemical antidepressants for people in that country. They'd never had them before in Cambodia. And the local doctors, the Cambodians, were like, hey, well, what are antidepressants? They'd never heard of them. So he told them, and they said, oh, we don't need them. We've already got antidepressants. And he was like, what do you mean? He thought they were going to tell him about some kind of herbal remedy. Instead, they told him a story. There was a farmer in their community who worked in the rice fields. And one day he stood on a landmine and he got his leg blown off. So they gave him an artificial limb. They gave him physical rehab. And a few months later, he went back to work in the rice fields. But apparently it's really painful to work underwater when you've got an artificial limb. And I'm guessing it's pretty traumatic to go back and work in the fields where you got blown up. The guy started to cry a lot. He refused to get out of bed. He developed what we would call classic depression. This is when the Cambodian doctors said to Dr. Summerfield, well, that's when we gave him an antidepressant. And Dr. Summerfield said, well, what was it? They explained that they went and sat with him. They listened to him. They realized that his pain made sense. You only had to listen to him for 5 minutes to see why he was so distressed. One of the doctors figured, if we bought this guy a cow, he could become a dairy farmer. He wouldn't be in this position that was screwing him up so much. So they bought him a cow. Within a couple of weeks, his crying stopped. Within a month, his depression was gone. It never came back. They said to Dr. Summerfield, so you see, doctor, that cow, that was an antidepressant. That's what you mean, right? Now, if you've been raised to think about depression the way we have, that it's primarily or entirely a kind of biological malfunction, that sounds like a joke, right? I went to my doctor for an antidepressant. She gave me a cow. But what those Cambodian doctors knew intuitively from this individual, unscientific anecdote is what the leading medical body in the whole world, the World Health Organization, has been trying to tell us for years. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, you're not weak, you're not crazy, you're not in the main a machine with broken parts. You're a human being with unmet needs. And what you need is love and practical support to get your deeper needs met. Now, there's lots of ways we can do that, and I've seen different ways we can do it all over the world that I can talk about. But it begins with thinking about the problem differently, because we've been taught to think of depression, anxiety, all sorts of things as malfunctions, like a kind of glitch in a computer program. I would argue, and most importantly, the World Health Organization argues, and the best scientists are now arguing, that these are not primarily malfunctions. There could be some biological contributions, of course, but these are primarily signals. They're signals that your deeper psychological needs are not being met. And that opens up a very different set of solutions. So the first thing we have to do is start listening to the signals and honoring the signals. Because for a long time, we've just been insulting the signals or ignoring them or saying they're just a biological problem or they're a sign of weakness. We need to understand that they are telling us something really important.
Yeah. And I'm so with you on this in terms of these not being pathologies. The fact that we have pathologized what I would call mental health in our country to treat it like it's a disease, like anxiety is a disease and depression's a disease that you need to be treated for, I just think is so backwards and so wrong. I mean, it's not to say that you can't treat these things, so to speak, but there's just, it's, to me, it's like being mentally out of shape. And so you gotta look at what's causing that and like train your way out of it. So getting back to my question there.
I think that's it's so important what you just said. And there's someone who really helped me to see that. You should interview her. You'd really like her. A woman called Dr. Johann Hari.
Okay.
So Joanne, I think to be 22 years ago now, I think. Joanne gave birth to a daughter called Cheyenne who died at birth. And literally hours after her baby died, the doctor gave her antidepressants. And she said, "What are these for?" And he said, "Well, you're going to be really distressed. These will make it less bad." And she said, but I'm not depressed. My baby died. Like,
yeah,
I should feel bad. I have to feel
right.
bad.
Yes.
Like, this will disrupt the grieving process. And the doctor was completely puzzled. Anyway, Joanne is also a professor of social work, and she obviously sometime later began to research this and discovered that, I forget the figure, but some staggering percentage of parents whose children die are drugged. And she starts interviewing really rapidly. And she starts to interview parents in this position. She starts to investigate this and develops an argument, which I find persuasive, that this is bad for the grieving process. But she also discovered this other really interesting thing about grief. So years before, in the 1950s, for a long time, there wasn't a standard definition of depression that doctors used all over the country. Doctors were just calling people depressed based on their own definition of it, which obviously isn't a good thing. So something called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the thing that doctors and insurance companies use, they decided we've got to have a standard definition of depression. So psychiatrists wrote one for the first time. And it basically drew up 10 symptoms, pretty obvious things like crying uncontrollably a lot, feeling uncontrollably sad. You could guess what they are. It drew up this list of 10 of them, and it said if you have, I think it was more than 6 of these symptoms for more than a year, you're not, you're depressed, right? Sorry, I'll say that again. So it said if you have more than 6 of these 10 symptoms for more than a year, you're depressed, right? And give them whatever help you can give them, right? So psychiatrists started to use this. But after a while, they came back and said, oh, we've got a bit of a problem here. These are also the symptoms of grief. So if we use this criteria, we're going to have to diagnose every grieving person as depressed, right? Because if someone you love dies, this is how you feel. And they were like, oh shit, that's not what we meant.
Yeah.
So they did something that got known as the grief loophole, where they said, if you have any 6 of these 10 symptoms for more than a year, you're depressed unless someone you love has died, in which case it's perfectly normal, right? But that begged the question, well, why is someone you love dying the only reason why you're allowed to feel shit?
Yeah.
What if you lost your job? What if you're living in a tunnel underneath Las Vegas? What if, you were made to do terrible things in a war? Or we can all imagine all sorts of things that might make someone feel like shit, right? And the psychiatrists came like, oh, that's not what we meant. Because as Dr. Cacciatore puts it, we have a psychiatric system that is not designed to acknowledge context, right? So they just cut back more and more the amount of time you're allowed to grieve until eventually you were allowed to grieve for like 2 weeks when your baby dies. And then if you're still sad after that, you're mentally ill. And then they just got rid of the grief exception altogether. So now you can be diagnosed mentally ill if you're really sad because your baby died yesterday, right?
Yeah.
So I think that really illustrates, I think it reveals something really important. It's very revealing, I think, that grief and depression have the same symptoms. Because I actually think what depression is, in some ways, is grief for yourself. It's grief for your own life. It's grief for your own needs not being met. Now, it's many things. There are other things going on, but I think that's important.
Yeah, for sure. It just makes me think of what you said at the beginning about emotional health. And like, yeah, that's it right there, emotional health. I'm going to reference veterans here. And it's like, we might not get diagnosed with depression necessarily or even get pharmaceuticals, but we sure spend a lot of time, at least I did, not allowing ourselves to grieve over lost teammates, right? People, someone you were close to, very close to, who was killed, maybe right next to you. And we respond with just like, nope, not gonna deal with that right now. Just stuff that down. And it's just a terrible response to that. And it's kind of
so important what you're saying, Chris, because even think about the language that will then be applied to that person when they do start to grieve. Very often they'll be told they have post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right. Yes.
Right. I would argue it's the disordered person who doesn't grieve.
Yes.
If my baby dies and I'm not grieving, that's the sign there's something wrong for me. If you're, if the people you served alongside, the people you loved, died, your comrades died, and you never get to grieve, that's the disordered person, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So to me, even the language we use, and it's often meant in a well-intentioned way, because what we've created as a culture is a completely false division where it's often described as brain or blame, right? Either there's something wrong with your brain and it's a disorder, or you're to blame, you're weak. I would go, right, but there's a third option here, guys, right? Where, of course, there are things happening in your brain. We are biological beings. And of course, there can be factors in your brain and other factors in your biology that can make these problems worse. But, you know, it's neither brain nor blame in most cases. In most cases, it's the wider environment, the society. And once you understand that, well, we can change those, or your psyche, and we can deal with those things. We can change those things.
Yeah, for sure. And when you talk about like, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder, it's like, well, yeah, you spend 20 years basically emotionally dysregulated and resisting potential emotions. Like, no shit, it all comes flowing out all at once. And that's like, you know, finally your body and your brain, like trying to release itself of all this stuff. And to your point, like, yeah, that shouldn't surprise anybody. And that shouldn't be like, you know, something we consider people to be broken from. You're not broken.
It's so interesting because someone said something to me once that's really stayed with me. So I had a friend called Marie Colvin, who lots of people listening will be vaguely aware of, or even more aware of. There was a Hollywood movie about her. So she was a American-British war correspondent, and she was the first Western war correspondent to be killed in the war in Syria. She was blown up by Bashar al-Assad. She was kind of famous. She had an eye patch because she had her eye shot out in Sri Lanka a few years before, and she kept going back to war zones. And she was a freakishly brave person. I was once outside a nightclub with Marie, and she was smoking a cigarette, and the bouncer said to her, "You shouldn't smoke, it's bad for you." And she said, "Believe me, it's not smoking that will kill me." But Marie did in fact die. And I remember after her funeral, someone who'd been a war correspondent saying to me, you know, to get through the day, you have to have a series of what he called predictive hypotheses. So when I finish this interview, I've got to go and see my friend. If I cross the road and I see a car coming towards me, I assume just automatically if that car sees me, it'll slow down, right? We have a million predictive hypotheses like that, right? There's someone crossing me in the street, I assume that they'll just walk past me, right? And he said, if you're in a war zone, like Marie was kind of crazy towards the end. If you're in a war zone, your predictive hypotheses don't work in a war zone. The car might just fucking run you over. The guy walking towards you in the street probably isn't going to just walk past you, right? So your predictive hypotheses become scrambled. So in your rational mind, you can know, oh, right, I'm in Iowa City now. I'm not in Baghdad. But your mind, your deeper psyche has completely scrambled predictive hypotheses. So you're in a state of heightened vigilance and adrenalization, all sorts of things are going on. And I really saw that. I mean, obviously I've been to war zones myself, but as a journalist, but also if I think about people I know who've worked in jobs like that, I know a lot of cops. I know a lot of people who live in tunnels, fairly high stakes environment. A lot of drug cartel members who I got to know for chasing the scream. I think about them that mode. Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's just it's like this other, you talk so much about kind of addiction and depression and that aspect of it, that like disconnection aspect. There's this other side, especially when I think of those types of people, which is a lot of folks out there, whether they're military or first responders or whatever, who have this other component to all of this, which is this like ramped up nervous system kind of thing, or like dysregulated nervous system thing. And I could talk about this for probably an hour or so, but but it's just that, you spend long enough in these types of environments where you become dysregulated on a nervous system level. Some people would say like a limbic system level, where it's just, you're hypervigilant or, you're anxious all the time. And it totally makes sense to me because you've changed your baseline. Like you're talking about, the world becomes unpredictable. You live in an unpredictable place all the time. You work there. And then, think about cops, right? It's one thing to be in the military where you go deploy to a combat zone and then you come back and then you maybe go back and forth like we've done for the last 20 years. That's hard enough. Cops have to do that dangerous stuff in their backyard, right? They live in the place where that's going on. And a friend of mine clued me into that. Like maybe a few months ago, we were talking about this kind of thing. He does mental health work, and it was like, man, I never even thought about that. Like the fact that they're in that environment all the time. Like, so how can they ever feel safe, really? Right? Like, sort of innately, inherently safe, even if it's not a conscious thing, but subconsciously. So look, I know you're short on time and I want to get to your new book. Like I could probably keep going with all of this stuff. But let's talk about Magic Pill and kind of the diet drugs and your experience here. So once again, this, I think, was born out of personal experience for you, your relationship with food. Sadly, I think a friend of yours named Hannah, right, who passed away. And then you also, are you still taking Ozempic? Because you were when you wrote the book.
Yeah, this is very relevant to veteran communities because the levels of obesity among people who've gone through trauma and war are stunningly high. I think it's really worth us digging into that. But for me, very well, some people listening won't know what we're talking about. So we've got a new kind of weight loss drug, right?
Yep.
And you might have heard about this as a kind of fad or a kind of craze. I've got to tell you, having interviewed the leading scientists in the world on this is not a fad. This is not a craze. There has been a staggering medical breakthrough. We now, as one of the scientists put it to me, we have cracked the code of what controls human appetite. So we now have diet drugs. The most famous are Ozempic and Wegovy, which are the same drug with different names, which produce. So if you take Ozempic or Wegovy, you will lose on average 15% of your body weight in a year. If you take Mounjaro, which is the next in this new class of drugs, you will lose on average 21% of your body weight within a year. And if you take Triple G, which will be available probably next year, the average person loses 24% of their body weight, which is almost the same as bariatric surgery, just from a tiny little injection in your leg or your stomach once a week. So this is huge, right? And when I first learned about this, I immediately felt two completely contradictory things. The first thing I thought was, well, this could save my life, because I was about to turn 44, which is the age my grandfather was when he died of a heart attack.
Oh, wow.
Loads of the men in my family get fat and die, like young, right? My dad had terrible heart problems, though he survived them. My uncle died of a heart attack. My grandfather died, so I never got to know him. And I was fat, right? I was overweight. I'd been overweight most of my adult life. I had periods where I dieted, but the weight always came back. So I thought, wow, if we've really got a drug that could reduce or even reverse obesity, that's a big deal, right? And I knew that even then, I think I would have known that obesity causes or makes worse over 200 diseases and complications, right? Biggest killer in the United States by far. So I thought, wow. I also thought, wait a minute, this sounds way too good to be true. There must be some fucking catch here, right? So I went on this big journey all over the world to try to get to the bottom of this, from Iceland to Minneapolis to Japan, to really deeply investigate what these drugs and this astonishing revolution are going to mean for all of us, to figure out who should take these drugs, who shouldn't take these drugs, what are the benefits, what are the risks, how do they make you feel? But think about this in relation. Yeah, sorry. That was a long answer.
No. I mean, but keep going with that. So, I mean, I think this is one of these things. People are very getting back to emotional health, right? People are very emotional about this thing, about they're on both sides of the fence on this. I actually didn't know that much about all of this. I had kind of heard the side effect aspect of this, like bone loss and other things about Ozempic. And I think I even had to check some of my own, I don't want to say prejudices, but my own feelings about kind of like people that are overweight in general, right? There's stuff you talk about in here about stigma and about shame towards this and, you know, what gets people to do this in the first place? Because I even think of, you know, all of this stuff about addiction, right? Like, I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about addiction to food in some respect here, right? And getting back to the kind of the same thing before, it's like saying that food causes obesity is a little bit like saying drugs cause addiction. It's like, yeah, but wind it back. What's really going on with people? So yeah, I mean, talk about your journey, what you found out about the drugs, their effectiveness, their side effects, the sort of larger societal things that came out of this journey. And even like, there's a piece in the end of this book where you talk about Japan, which I thought was so interesting, about them not having this problem. And even the fact that it was a decision they made on a societal level after World War II to be like, yeah, we got to change the food here. You know, so this is a huge question, obviously. Like there's so much in this. It's like summarize the whole book, you know?
You know, it's interesting because the subtitle of the book is The Extraordinary Benefits and Disturbing Risks of the New Weight Loss Drugs. And I'm not temperamentally a kind of even-handed person, but the truth is that the reality of these drugs is quite complicated. So the first thing to know is there are staggering benefits to these drugs. And the main reason for that is that obesity is unbelievably bad for you.
Right.
And I'm embarrassed to say, the thing that most shocked me in the research for the book was the thing I thought I'd known pretty much all my life, which is just how unbelievably bad for you being overweight or obese is. And, you know, we tend to think, oh, okay, overweight, you know, we picture some hugely obese person, which I was not that, right? I had a BMI of 30. So I was, you know, just the borderline between overweight and obese. Just being overweight is really, really bad for you.
Yeah. Well, there's people that would argue against that though, too, right? There's people that healthy at any weight, that kind of thing. And I think, and you were very open-minded in the book about that. You were like, okay, let me really be objective here. And you kind of, you know, like you're saying, we're like, no, that's not true. Like it is unhealthy.
We have to communicate that message in a really compassionate and loving way.
Of course.
But the scientific evidence could not be more clear or overwhelming that being overweight or obese makes you much more likely to get basically every medical condition we fear, almost all of them. You're more likely to get dementia, you're more likely to get cancer, you're more likely to get heart disease, you're more likely to get diabetes, which knocks on average 15 years off your life, type 2 diabetes. Staggering. You're more likely to have a limb amputated. You know, more people in the US have to have a limb amputated because of obesity-caused diabetes than because they got shot every year. And you will have noticed a lot of us get shot, right? So obesity is unbelievably bad for you. And these drugs massively reduce or reverse obesity, and that is producing staggering health benefits. If you take these drugs, on average, your chance of having a heart attack or stroke goes down by 20% within 2 years. I mean, that's mind-blowing, right? So we're seeing extraordinary health benefits. there are also 12 significant risks that I go through in the book. And one of them, I think, may relate in an interesting way to veterans. So I want to talk about that carefully because obviously I'm not a veteran and I don't want to equate my experience in a direct way, but I think there's a mild analogy here, which might sound a bit weird at first, but bear with me. I had a weird experience because when I took the drugs, so I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I've got to write. If I'm going to write about this, I've got to take them. So I started taking Ozempic a year and a half ago, a bit more, and I lost an enormous amount of weight. I'm terrible at doing conversions.
Oh yeah, I got it. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I got it. Don't worry about it.
You shouldn't have rejected our tea party.
Yeah, but, just don't go into stone, and we're okay. As long as you don't start using stone.
I lost 42 pounds.
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, a lot. And a weird thing happened. The first 6 months, I lost a massive amount of weight. I was getting what I wanted, right? I felt physically much healthier. My back pain went away. My neighbor's hot gardener hit on me. Like loads of good things were happening. But weirdly, I didn't actually feel better. If anything, I felt slightly worse. I thought, this is weird. What's that about? I thought maybe it's a coincidence. Maybe it's the drugs are affecting my brain because these drugs do work primarily by changing your brain. Maybe it's that. And I noticed there's some scientists who are concerned these drugs may be causing depression, although there's others who disagree. And I wasn't depressed, but I had a lower mood. And I had a real epiphany about this in the branch of KFC on West Sahara in Vegas, which is the grimmest KFC in the world, and I've been to a lot of them. So I was in Vegas researching this book that I mentioned, and I was someone I knew and really loved who lived in the tunnels was murdered, and I was researching this. And as you can imagine, that was very painful and difficult. And so really on autopilot, I went to this branch of KFC that I've been to 1,000 times. And I did what I would have done before I was on Ozempic. I just ordered a bucket of fried chicken. And I sat there and I looked at it and I thought, oh shit, I can't eat this. Because when you're on Ozempic, you can't overeat. You would vomit if you overate. So I had like one chicken drumstick, but that was it. I couldn't eat anymore because the drugs make you feel very full very fast. And I remember thinking, sometimes you have a thought and it almost feels like someone else has said it to you because it's said with such clarity in your head.
Yeah.
I thought, oh, you're just going to have to feel like shit then, right? And I suddenly realized, of course, I had some awareness of this before, but I was like, ever since I was a little kid growing up in this environment where there was a lot of addiction, one of the main ways I calmed myself was by overeating, right? By stuffing food into me. And I couldn't do that anymore. And I realized, oh, to have comfort food taken away from you in some ways it's a good thing, right? The way these drugs work is they interrupt your eating patterns, which is obviously a good thing. It's why you lose weight, right? It's why your health gets better. But what that can also do is interrupt some of the deep underlying emotional drivers of your eating. Now, again, that's a good thing in the long term. There are better ways for me to deal with feeling sad about my friend being murdered than Colonel Sanders, clearly, but that can be a difficult transition. And that's one of the 12 kind of risks. So I think what everyone's got to do is weigh, and I tried to go through this in the book because I don't think there's one answer that's right for everyone. You've got to weigh the risks of being overweight or obese if you are. If you're not overweight or obese, don't take these drugs unless you've got type 2 diabetes, which is another use for them. But if you're overweight or obese and you've tried diet and exercise and they haven't worked for you, and I've never met a fat person who hasn't tried diet and exercise, but if you've never tried them, try it first. There's much less risk to that. If you're an overweight person who's tried diet and exercise and it hasn't worked, what I recommend you do is go through the risks of obesity that I outline in the book, think about them deeply and which might apply to you, and then go through these 12 risks that I talk about, which of them will apply to you or may apply to you. And you've got to weigh them. And there isn't an easy or obvious answer to that. You've got to do that for yourself. Also, I hope the book will help make people understand how the drugs make you feel physically and psychologically, what they're going to mean for the economy and the society. This is, you may think this is some kind of a Hollywood fad. This is coming for people who live where you are. Some estimates are that, within a few years, half of Americans will be taking these drugs, right? Pretty soon the price is going to fall dramatically. This is going to be a society shaking and transforming event, the invention of these drugs, for good and for bad. So yeah, I hope it gives us a chance to really think deeply about this as this staggering scientific transformation.
Yeah. Do you have to go? I want to make sure. I know you said.
Fortunately, I do. Yeah, I should go in like 2 minutes. Sorry.
Okay. Oh man, because there's a couple questions I really want to follow up on there. But maybe we'll do it next time if you've got to go in a couple of minutes. But yeah, shoot, there's a couple things you said there that I really wanted to follow up on. But in the interest of time, we'll wrap this up. So I guess what I would say to everyone that's listening to this, like, it's a great book about this topic, and I found it very elucidating and making me think a little bit differently about this issue. And to your point, sort of weighing things out there too, of like, hey, I'm a very big believer in diet and exercise, like, the kind of discipline of that, and like it does work. Like, we know these things are effective. However, I think some of the things you talk about in there of like, yeah, but if someone is struggling that bad and it's either they take the drug or they're going to die, like, yeah, okay. Or their life is just going to be absolutely miserable. Like, okay, I see the value there. I'm not a big proponent of drugs in general, of kind of any kind, but yeah, I thought it was extremely illuminating as a piece of work, and I really appreciate the fact that you wrote it. So anyway, I'm going to save some questions on that and other topics, because I really could spend a few hours with you, on all of the work that you put out. But thanks so much for spending this time with me today. And I hope we can do it again. And I should say too, I forgot at the beginning, we do have one other thing in common, which is we are alumni of the same school in England.
Oh, really?
Yep. You went to King's College. I went to Wolfson at Cambridge. I did my graduate degree over there. So we were off by a few years. You're a few years younger than me, but pretty close. Like we were pretty close to there at the same time. So yeah.
Oh, glad to hear it. And I meant to say, my publicist tasers me that if anyone wants to know where to get the audiobook, ebook, or physical books for any of my books, you can go to johannhari.com, johannhari.com. You can also see where to follow me on social media, but I will not follow you back because I don't look at that shit. That
was your third book. That's like sort of like stolen focus, right? We didn't even get into that, but
what else am I meant to say? I'm sure I meant to say something else. I meant to say some other shit, but I can't even remember it. My brain is dead. But yeah, you can find all that stuff there. You can also watch videos. You can find out what other people have said about my books, all that stuff.
Awesome. Well, thanks again.
What a pleasure.
And I hope you feel better. Thanks for listening to On the X, the official podcast of the Navy SEAL Foundation and an Ironclad original series sponsored by Mechanics Wear. You can learn more about Johann Hari at johannhari.com and about the foundation at navysealfoundation.org. You can also text the word On the X to 60104 to join our text subscriber list. See you next time.